Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial we're going to look at something called the Constructor Initialization List in C++. So I've got this code that I wrote in the last tutorial, except that I've stripped out stuff from the last tutorial involving memory locations. So what we've got now is we've got a simple person class with a name and an age that has two constructors. One's a default constructor that just assigns kind of default values for name and age. One is a parameterized constructor that takes name and age and updates the instance variables with the values you supply. We've also got a toString method that returns some information about our object as a string, and we're using that in the main method to output information about these two objects. I've got rid of person1 here, but I might pull it back again. So we've got person2, person3, and we're outputting some information about them using this toString method, and the results look like this. So we supply values to our constructor, names and ages, and then we're outputting information about the object in our main method using our toString method that we created. Now, in the last tutorial, we define this constructor here by, we supply it with parameters, and we use those here, and then we're using this to disambiguate between our argument names and the instance variable names that we're actually setting. But there is another way to do this, which is actually more efficient, I suppose, in terms of speed, although it's not really going to make a difference to most programs, and that is the constructor initialization list. So what I've showed you so far is very, very useful, and sometimes you need all this stuff. It's also very useful to know about this. But there's another way that I'm about to show you now, which is the recommended way to do this, where it's possible, and in this case it's certainly possible. So instead of initializing name and age here, using these values, using this pointer, we can delete this, and after the closing round bracket of the prototype of the constructor at the point where we actually implement it, we can type a colon, and then we type the name of a variable we want to initialize, let's say name, so that's this up here, and then we put round brackets after name, and in there we supply the value that we want to initialize it with, which here is going to be the parameter that we pass in, also called name. So although this looks ambiguous, it's not. C++ knows that this means the actual instance variable name, and it knows that this one in the brackets is what we use to initialize that, and it's going to be the argument that's passed in. We can do the same with age. We can put a comma here, age, and pass in age like that, and that will initialize these instance variables with the arguments that we pass to the constructor. So let's run that now, and we get the same results as before. We can do the same with this kind of default constructor. Here we're not passing in parameters, but we can type a colon here and then type name and initialize it with something. So this time it's not a parameter, it's just a literal value. Let's put empty quotes, or we can put unnamed or whatever we like in there. Then let's put a comma in because we want to do age as well, and set age to 0. And now we can get rid of these here. Let's go back to main.cpp because I want to put in person1 again. Let's say person1. So this will use the default constructor. We won't pass parameters to it, so it will invoke this constructor here, which is this one here. And let's output that in cout as well. So we'll output persons 1, 2, and 3 here, and let's run that. And so the first one will have unnamed with age set to 0, and then the second two, the second and the third, we will have the values that we passed in there. Now, sometimes this is unwieldy. Like if you have a lot of different things to initialize in your constructor, then sometimes it just sort of makes sense to type them out here rather than having a massive ugly list here. You can mix both of these as well. You can initialize some things in the constructor initialization list and other things within the body, the implementation of the constructor, if you need to. There's nothing wrong with mixing them, but it's best to stick to one style, and this is the best style to use where it's feasible to do so. If you need to do any kind of complex initialization of these variables, other than supplying either parameters like here or literal values, then you're going to have to do it in the implementation if you've got more code that needs to run in order to figure out what to initialize them with. You would have to do it in the implementation. But for simple variable values that take either a parameter or a literal value, you can initialize those instance variables in the constructor initialization list. Now, because here we've got very little code, actually, it sort of makes sense just to put this in the header. We don't really even need to have these implementations down here. Let's just move them to the header. So let's cut this stuff. Let's cut the initialization list for the default constructor and just bung it in here like that. And we've got a sort of error there, syntax error. Let's get rid of the implementation, save this, and hopefully this will work. Did I do something wrong? Yeah, I think we need the curly brackets here. That's why it's complaining. Yeah, of course we do. Let's put them in. So let's bung in these. So if we're putting the initialization list in, we're going to have to supply an implementation, even though it's an empty implementation. So that takes care of that. And now we don't need the implementation in the CPP file. Let's do the same for the other constructor here. Let's copy this. I'll cut it actually, and we'll get rid of that. Save it, go to person.h and bung this in here. And again, we're going to have to put the implementation in there. So now if I run this, it should work as before. There we go. So again, it's a small thing, but for me, I was actually doing C++ for a long time before I dared to use the initialization list, just because it somehow looked really complicated. But it isn't at all. As you can see, it's actually very simple. And if you just practice typing this a bit, you'll quickly get the hang of it. So as always, I'd recommend create your own class, give it 2 or 3 constructors, and initialize your instance variables, this time in the initialization list, to see how that works, and that will fix it in your memory. Try doing it in your CPP file, and then also try doing it in a header file with the inline constructor syntax. So you can use these on constructors. You can't use them on set methods. At least I'm pretty sure you can't. This is purely a thing for constructors. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. Until next time, happy coding.